Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today's session. My name is Vicki Lightbound. I'm the Director for the Water Innovation Program at Alberta Innovates. We've had a lot of interest in today's session, so I'll give it a couple seconds here while people join in. I would like to take a moment today to respectfully acknowledge that we are coming to you virtually from Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 territory in Métis Regions 3 and 4 in Alberta. I will highlight that the reach of this work and its activities influence and are influenced by all treaty territory and all Métis region in Alberta, not just those from which we come to today. This acknowledgement respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all Indigenous people of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. For those of you not familiar, Alberta Innovates is a provincial corporation created to support research and innovation activities. We provide funding programs, advice, connections, technical expertise, and applied research services across the whole innovation journey. The Water Innovation webinars share ideas and outcomes from projects funded through Alberta Innovate's Water Innovation Program and highlight other important water initiatives within the province. I hope this session will provide you some valuable information and spark discussion. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can submit them through the Q&A box. We will try to answer as many questions as we can after we hear from all of our speakers. With that, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Alberta Innovates Water Innovation webinar. Today's topic is Alberta's water resources in a hydrogen economy. Hydrogen production in Alberta is a significant economic diversification opportunity and an important pathway to achieving net zero targets. The rapid increase in projects and future development requires careful planning and understanding of environmental trade-offs, especially in regions where water supply is already limited. This session will provide an overview of the hydrogen sector in Alberta and examples of efforts underway to understand and manage potential impacts, including the potential for new development to be affected by inadequate current or future water supply. Today, you'll hear from two speakers, Dave Van Den Assem, Director, Hydrogen Center of Excellence, Director, Clean Technology at Alberta Innovates. You'll also hear from Steve Herman, Director of Engineering at Water Smart Solutions. Now let's get started. I'll pass it over to Dave.
Hello, thank you very much for that introduction, much appreciated. And thank you everybody for participating in the sessions today. I will get my slides up and running for you. So the Hydrogen Center of Excellence is set up through a grant from the government of Alberta to enable the development and advancement of hydrogen and its integration into the energy system, both for use locally within the province, but also for export opportunities. So the Center of Excellence's main responsibility is for accountability for implementation of the hydrogen innovation-related activities within the province, and looking for promising technologies that will help advance hydrogen and its use throughout the province, and again for export, and as well as enabling low carbon opportunities through the use of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. So in 2021, the provincial government set out a Alberta Hydrogen Roadmap, which outlined the initiatives, the direction and the guidance that the province would need for implementing some hydrogen opportunities within the province. And so this is a high-level summary of that. The ambition of creating and integrating hydrogen into the energy system and being a global supplier of choice for hydrogen by 2030. The policy pillars you see across the top there are the main focus areas that the roadmap intended to drive forward, and the Center of Excellence is taking a bit of responsibility in some of those key areas, which I've highlighted in the outline piece there. So enabling carbon capture and storage, as I mentioned, so that we can have low carbon intensity hydrogen. De-risking investments, activating technology and innovation, which is a core activity for Alberta Innovates to do, supporting the regulatory and codes and standards efficiency. And of course, the government of Alberta takes the lead in that work, but we do a supporting role as required. And leading the way in building alliances. So building a lot of the connections with the different initiatives that are out there, with the different communities that want to engage, and so on. The main focus areas within the the roadmap and for Alberta Innovates and the Hydrogen Center of Excellence are in residential and commercial heating, power generation and storage, exports, mobility, and industrial processes. These are the main areas that we want to focus on for implementing hydrogen. And of course, we have some outcomes that we'd like to see: decarbonizing hard to abate sectors, increasing economic activity in the province, and extending the natural gas value chain. We'll get into that a little bit more. So the Center of Excellence is broken down into three main activity areas. The ecosystem pieces, which are looking at studies that are needed to support our knowledge generation in hydrogen. That's a new area, so there's a lot of knowledge gaps that we need to help fill. Public awareness, we've launched some initial activities baselining current public acceptance of hydrogen, and we're working towards plans to help advance that and develop it. And then partnerships, as I mentioned earlier, helping connect folks, companies, and other resources within the province. The technology piece is our main one, and we're covering everything from production all the way through to how the hydrogen gets to the end use, and the different end uses that we talked about in the previous slide. I've circled those two at the end, as that tends to be where the water impacts tend to show up, or the water footprint tends to show up more, and we can get into that a little bit more in subsequent slides. And finally, we have some pilot testing facilities and testing services that through our subsidiaries and our friends Innotech Alberta and Seaford Technologies. So they have additional capabilities to, if you have a piece of equipment that you wanted to test that's a hydrogen specific piece, they have the ability to go and do that there. And as I mentioned, codes and standards. So we cover a fair bit of ground. I'll go lightly through some of these activities that we're progress on these activities, and then we can get into some of the specifics around the water use. So on the capital side, we have spent $10 million to augment the Innotech and Seaford facilities, and we were able to partner with our federal friends, Prairie's Economic Development Canada, for an additional $3 million to help get these facilities set up and up and running to serve the needs of the industry for testing and whatnot. On the service capacity side, we have a number of projects that are in the system now, and then quite a few more proposals that are coming through the system. And again, these are for a wide range of studies and other activities and community building activities. So lots of fun things happening in that space. On the public awareness side, as I mentioned earlier, we have done a baseline survey, and we have a strategy and engagement plan that's about ready to go forward and be enacted. On the other initiatives that we're supporting, there's a 5,000 vehicle challenge initiative that's spearheaded by Edmonton Global and the Transition Accelerator and a few others. So this is the idea of getting groups together that are interested in pursuing hydrogen for transport and all across the value chain, and getting them together to try to see where the natural synergies are and opportunities to build some big projects. So we're starting to see a few more vehicles being concepted and put together. And so there's going to be an exciting time in that area over the next little while. Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub, we have representation from the center within that group. The Calgary Region Hydrogen Hub is in development, so there's exciting things happening around there, and there's a few other hydrogen hubs that are being contemplated and planned in the province. So lots of activity going to be happening in the near future there. Our friends at Emissions Reduction Alberta have also done a $25 million grant fund, and they're in the middle of finalizing that competition right now. And so that's pretty exciting to have them involved, because they work more on the late stage of technology development through to a first commercial operation of an innovation. We tend to work in the earlier stage where we're doing the pilot stage and the R&D, research and development work that needs to be done to get things ready for that late stage. So by putting the two of us together, we have the full range available for companies to help advance their solutions. We're also a friend of the British Columbia Centre for Innovation in Clean Energy, and are helping each other with keeping on top of the opportunities that happen both within our respective provinces, but potential opportunities to cross over between borders. And Natural Resources Canada is also involved in a lot of our competitions, which we're going to hear about, and we support them with a number of other initiatives. So there's good community there. On the technology development side, we have $38 million available of that $50 million from the government set aside for technology advancement. We did a first competition about a year ago. So those, and we awarded $20 million, 10 of ours, 10 of NRCan's, to 18 projects that cover the whole value chain. And so those projects have now a year under their belt, and they are off and running and doing some great things. We have a second competition that we are about to finalize this week, actually. And that is for, again, across the whole value chain. We have $25 million available, 20 from us and 5 from our friends at Enercan. And so this one we're anticipating will also cover the full value chain as well. So we're very excited to be able to announce those soon. This is where Steve's going to start giving you a little bit more information, but I'll set the stage for him. We have different methods of hydrogen production that we can use in the province, and each of them has a different environmental footprint, including water footprint. So there's a greenhouse gas footprint through CO2 emissions, or there's a water footprint through water use. And on the screen here, you'll see the autothermal reforming and steam methane reforming. That's the ATR and the SMR. Those are the large-scale centralized facilities that you'd see in the industrial heartland, for example, in near Edmonton and other regions. And they have large production capabilities, large scale, but is very localized in their region. And they have a certain water footprint that they use as part of their process. Electrolysis is splitting water using electricity. Now, that electricity can be from renewable sources or from the grid. Electrolysis, because it directly involves water through the entire process, has typically a more significant water footprint than the other ones, which rely on natural gas, methane as one of their primary feedstocks, in addition to water. The next one on that list is pyrolysis, and that is a method of stripping the hydrogen off of a methane molecule without the use of water, and you end up with, or oxygen, so you end up with a solid carbon product on one hand and hydrogen gas on the other hand. So that's an interesting technology, and we'll see how that plays in, that water piece plays in a little bit further. And then gasification is another one, which is a suite of different solutions, really. And it covers a lot of the waste to energy, waste to value add products, and biomass to value add products types of solutions. And so that one tends to have a bit of a footprint on it as well. And so I'm going to jump to the next slide here. And this is, in addition to the water footprint of hydrogen production, there's also a water footprint associated with carbon capture. So that is if we want to capture the CO2 out of an exhaust stack, for example, a lot of the processes used for that do involve water. So we want to account for that footprint, and it becomes a trade-off between how the water footprint of CO2 production offsets or counterbalances with the different methods of hydrogen production. We want to find the optimum there. So we're minimizing the impacts on water resources, minimizing the impacts on CO2 emissions, while providing energy that we all need. And so you'll see on the graphic there's a handful of different methods of CO2 capture from a number of different energy production methods. And so you see there's a range. The DACCS is direct air carbon capture and sequestration. And so that's a lot of the solutions that will filter just ambient air and scoop out the CO2 from that and then concentrate it up for sequestering downhole. And the last two on that category are bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And that is where we take biomass typically and pyrolyze it or gasify it and take that CO2 and sequester it. And because it came from biomass to begin with, it's not typically counted within the greenhouse gas accounting framework because it's already in the carbon system. But we want to make sure that we're looking at it as an important negative carbon opportunity, but also that it does have a significant water footprint. I'm going to just gloss over these next images here because Steve's going to get into this in much more detail. What I want you to take away from this is that we have a lot of wind resources. We have a lot of solar resources for renewable power. They happen to be predominantly in the southern part of the province. And not surprisingly, on the water resource map, the one on the right-hand side, where we have a lot of wind and a lot of sun, a lot of heat, we tend to not have as much water. And the water resources tend to be more in the central and northern part of the province. So that's going to come into play in our further conversations as we carry on here. So as I mentioned, water varies by region. There's different hydrogen production methodologies that all have a different footprint. There's different carbon capture opportunities that all have a different footprint to them. So we want to be able to optimize between all of those. So to summarize, we want to make sure that we've got a good match and we want to minimize impacts, maximize the benefits. And so we need to also be considerate of the water demand on the from CO2 capture activities. And we want to minimize these trade-offs. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will pass it along to Steve.
Thanks, Dave. Really great way to set the stage and start the conversation. And I'll get Steve to join us on video and share his screen.
All right, thanks, Becky, and thanks, Dave, for setting the stage. I think you laid things out nicely. I'll dive in and lever off some of that in a few places, and then looking forward to the Q&A. So I'm Steve Herman with Water Smart Solutions. We are a Calgary-based environmental consulting company, and we have a focus on water management for a sustainable economy. So this idea of hydrogen production and the impact it may have on the economy and on our water resources really piqued our interest very early on. So what I'm going to share today is some highlights from a study that we did last year looking at water impacts of hydrogen development across the province. This was funded by Alberta Innovates as the kind of primary funder under their water innovation program. We're also happy to have 5 industry participants who are co-funding and who were engaged in the process. And these were folks who were keen to better understand the potential of hydrogen as an economic engine, but also aware that it might have a water impact. Full report is available on our website. The whole URL is kind of an ugly one, so I just truncated it. But if you go to our site and go to publications and scroll down, you should be able to find it there. We also produced an infographic last year as well, which is on our site, and it's 2 pages instead of 90, so a little bit more digestible for folks. So I encourage you to check it out. And I should note that all the information that I'm going to show today is really sourced from publicly available information. We did have input and review and that sort of thing with our participants, but we are not presenting anything that is confidential or that has not been kind of aggregated and anonymized appropriately. So kind of high level, what I want to share with you today, touching on what Dave shared in terms of this transition to net zero, hydrogen's role within it. I think he set the stage well. So we'll glance on that and then kind of get into the meat and potatoes of the work. So looking at first, what does it take? What is the water footprint to produce hydrogen? Building on what Dave shared, and then comparing that to water availability across the province, which is our bread and butter of kind of understanding local water context. And then, putting those two things together and where are the opportunities, where are the potential mismatches, and then closing out kind of what do we do about it? What are our recommendations and what would we say are next steps? And I'll say it at the end. I want to say it up front as well. At WaterSmart, we're not anti-hydrogen or anti one thing or the other. We just want folks to look at it carefully and consider the water impacts and those trade-offs carefully and early in project development. We're not saying you can't do hydrogen anywhere, but if you're going to do hydrogen, do it thoughtfully. That's kind of the key takeaway. So as Dave outlined nicely, a lot of excitement around this transition to net zero and what that means for the local economy and frankly the global economy. Hydrogen being a key part of that potentially, especially in Alberta. We've got the hydrogen roadmap. We've got for a period in 2022, 2023, it felt like every week we were getting a new announcement about a project or a plan or something like that. Which is great. Lots of excitement, lots of energy being put towards it. And where we start to get interested at WaterSmart is when we think about all that enthusiasm and anticipation and production of hydrogen, comparing that to everything else that is going to continue to need water. So, if you think about it in the context of population growth in the province, looking at some numbers from the government of Alberta, thinking about our people, our water for food, water for environmental protection, water to produce energy, all of these competing water uses that constitute what we call the water energy food nexus, they need to be considered. And that's that trade-off piece that Dave is mentioning. If you take water from a water body and use it to produce hydrogen, does that mean you have less ability to produce food, for example? Or does that mean you have less ability to have a population center increase over time? So these are the kinds of trade-offs that we do a lot of work in, and we want it to better understand. And so that's what this study is all about. So kind of the first thing we looked at is, okay, how much water does it really take to produce hydrogen? And this is a graphical representation of what Dave went through. So I won't spend a ton of time on it. A couple key takeaways here. One being, we always say you can't make H2 without H2O. And potentially, theoretically, with the exception of pyrolysis, you really can't. If you look at the stoichiometry, the fundamental chemistry, water is required. You think about steam methane reforming of natural gas. Steam is in the name. So water is there. You can't quite work around it without violating the laws of physics. And then, the purple is kind of the absolute theoretical minimum water requirement. And then when you kind of hit reality, different projects will have different water requirements. So we estimated some ranges looking at, if you have a very efficient process, if you use air cooling instead of evaporative cooling, if you have a clean water source, so you don't need to do a lot of treatment, all those things will reduce the water footprint. And conversely, if you don't have those things, they will increase the water footprint. So that's the kind of green, yellow, red in terms of just estimating a per unit water demand for these various technologies. Pyrolysis, as Dave alluded to, is emerging. It's emerging technology. So pretty rough estimates on those water footprints that we'd love to be able to get some data on to improve. And then gasification. We didn't include a stoichiometric amount because the feedstock is so variable and the stoichiometry depends on what feedstock you use. So it's not zero, it's just hard to represent visually. One other key here is the use of the word consumption. And I'm being really deliberate on that as opposed to use, because consumption refers to the water that is taken out of the environment and it's not returned at that same location within a reasonable temporal scale. So if you think about a city, you take water out, it goes to people's homes, they use it, it goes back into the wastewater treatment system. We're pretty efficient processors, human bodies. So we end up returning about 75% of that water back to the environment after it's been treated. So that consumption is the net amount, that 25% that stays out of the environment. So with hydrogen, it's at different ratios of consumption versus overall use. But these numbers refer to what is consumed, what is being taken out of the environment and not returned. And with hydrogen, it is interesting because combusting hydrogen produces H2O, it produces water. But the challenge with that is it's I don't want to say in an absolute, but it's almost never combusted and returned in the same location as when it was taken out. So if you draw water out of the Bow River, you make hydrogen fuel that goes in a truck that drives across to Saskatchewan, and it combusts the fuel along the way. Yes, hydrogen is being turned back into water. The water vapor is reaching the environment, but it's not likely to rain back down into the Bow River Basin. So, from the perspective of that watershed, that water is gone. It's been consumed. So a key concept there to think about, and you'll see that the impact of that consumption compared to water availability later on in the presentation. Another way to look at it, again, just for context, is comparing the per unit of energy for hydrogen to traditional hydrocarbon fuels. So looking at water footprint per unit of energy. And so on the left, you can see the ATR, SMR, electrolysis, et cetera. And then we're comparing to things like gasoline, diesel, natural gas. Some people have argued, if we're going to get off of gasoline and replace it with hydrogen, perhaps that's a net water positive or net water no impact because gasoline requires its own water as well. And what this is trying to show here is it really depends. If you have a highly efficient, say, SMR process, and you're replacing a very inefficient diesel or gasoline alternative, then yes, perhaps you'll have a water impact that's positive or even net zero. But if you are taking a kind of medium efficiency process and trying to replace that with, or replace a hydrocarbon process that is highly efficient from a water perspective, you may have a water impact. So the devil's in the details, of course, but just another thing to think about in a kind of energy replacement perspective, you may or may not have a water impact. And ultimately, we need to look at that carefully before going ahead with building any of these projects. So we looked at per unit demands for hydrogen and the water footprint there. And then the next step was to look at, okay, where are all the projects that have been announced in the province? Where will this water demand actually occur and how much demand will it be? So this is a map showing what we could find. This is data as of kind of Q1, late Q1, early Q2, 2023. Showing all the project locations that were publicly announced. So there's another dozen or so projects that we are aware of that at that time did not have locations set. So they're not on this map. This is just the locations that we knew about. And the dots kind of show the quantity of individual projects, but not necessarily the scale of the projects themselves. So a small dot in one location doesn't necessarily mean it's not very much development is being planned there. We'll get into kind of the actual water footprint associated with those projects in later slides. So, this is touching on that a little bit. Across all of Alberta, if we look at the projects that have been announced, the technology that they are supposed to be using or plan to be using, and if it wasn't stated, we made an estimated guess or educated guess. You take that information, you take the size of the projects and the high, medium, low water footprints that we calculated and showed earlier, and this is what you get. Obviously, a very large range of water use, 120 to 500 million cubic meters per year. That's across the entire province. In a couple slides, we'll talk about where this gets really interesting in specific locations. And ultimately, the goal of this work is to understand that that's watershed specific, kind of local context specific implications. Drilling down kind of one layer more detailed than all of Alberta is looking at things like the Bow River Basin. So with all the projects that have been announced in places like Calgary, you have somewhere between 20 and 96 million cubes per year of consumption, and then more in the North Saskatchewan, so that Edmonton and Alberta industrial heartland region. Just for context, 96 million cubes of consumptive use in a year is about a city of 1.6 million people. If you kind of accounted for that consumption and return ratio that I mentioned earlier. So if you can kind of imagine another Calgary being plopped down somewhere in the Bow River Basin in terms of equivalent water demand, and that starts to give a bit of a sense of just how much water this is that we're talking about. And from there, you kind of think about, you know, is this location or that location an appropriate place for it? So that leads us into talking now about what water is available. We know what water is likely to be required from hydrogen. We can think about other demand as well in that water energy food nexus. Now let's compare to what is out there. What do we actually have available to us? And I'll start with a bit of a kind of water 101 in Alberta, just to give some context. It's quite complex, so I'm hoping that some of this will help give some context to what it means to say water availability. First and foremost, water is very variable across the province in many different ways. So as Dave alluded to, you know, we have little of our water resource in the south of the province. Most of it is in the north, whereas most of the population and a lot of the demand for water is in the south. So there's that kind of regional variability, and even at the sub-regional level, you can have one river that is a tributary of another, and the bigger one will have lots of water available, and the smaller one could be constrained. So you really do have to zoom in quite close to understand water availability at a location for a specific project. The other form of variability is in terms of timing. So this figure is showing historical data for the South Saskatchewan River at Medicine Hat. The blue is, the top of the blue is the upper quartile of all recorded flow over the period of record, and that lower blue line is the lower quartile. So somewhere between 75, below 75% and above 25% of the data exists in that blue shaded area. And then the red is the median. So this is a composite, it's a statistical simulation based on reported flows. So in any given year, the actual line would be much less smooth. You'd see more jags up and down and different things. But on an average basis, over many years, you kind of see this flow pattern. And the point here is from January to about March or April, flows are quite low. And then they are quite low in the winter as well. There's this peak in the mid a year where snow is melting in the Rockies, and that drives flows higher, and then they dip again later on. So understanding from a project perspective, if you need water the whole year, will you be able to access that water during January or during December as compared to July? And if flows are so low that you can't make use of them in those winter months, how will you mitigate that risk? So this figure is just showing water recorded flows. When you think about of that flow, how much is actually available to be diverted, that is a kind of a separate figure, and we'll show an example of that later on. That is all regulated under the Water Act. There's a whole pile of kind of regulatory instruments that inform at each water body what water is available for allocation and what water needs to stay in the river for environmental protection and to fulfill our obligations to send water to Saskatchewan. So, you can do a lot of math and modeling and crunching to understand, okay, what is actually available for new allocations and all these new hydrogen projects that will represent new water demands. One other note here is that this is data for the South Saskatchewan at Medicine Hat, but this trend, this kind of low winter, spring peak, and then low summer trend is pretty well universal across river systems that have their headwaters in the Rocky Mountains. So pretty well all of Alberta, you see the same trend, and it maybe looks a little different one river to the next, but that kind of shape is the same. Here's an example of that variability I talked about for a single year. So this is data from the Bow River in Calgary. Again, that blue is the upper and lower quartile of all recorded data over many decades. And then the red is what we saw in 2023. So in that particular year, the spring freshet was earlier than normal, and the later in the year flows were lower than normal. So modeling for kind of the 25th percentile or even a 10th percentile will help you understand kind of the general trend. But even in individual years, you can have greater variability or less water flowing through the system than you might expect. So we put it all together. We did this modeling looking at how the river flows across the province, or how the rivers flow across the province, and what has already been allocated across the province. And this is what we came up with in terms of water availability. This is a qualitative representation. In our report, we've gone into the details and we have some quantification of this available. Key thing to take away here is the variability regionally. And interesting to note that even if you are in the north, that doesn't necessarily mean you have access to all the water that you'll need. The Wapiti River, the Little Smoky River, for example, those are highlighted in the yellow there in the Peace region. And those are rivers that are fairly highly allocated relative to their capacity, and their flow. So to site a new project in that location, it's not necessarily a foregone conclusion that you'll have the water available. And then in the south, I think for many on the line, that's not a surprise to hear that there's limited water availability in the south. In fact, in 2007, the Bow, Oldman, and South Saskatchewan River Basin Water Allocation Order was issued by the government, and that prevents members of the public from submitting Water Act applications for licenses in that province, in that part of the province. So there is water being used, there's water being withdrawn, there's the potential to transfer existing licenses in that region, but no new water licenses will be issued for hydrogen. So that's a project risk that people need to consider if they're looking to site a project in that region. And we'll dive into a few of these locations just to get a bit more specific and give folks a bit more context around what this means. But looking at it even at this high level is a useful first step to say, hey, maybe we need to dig in a bit more on our water availability and those potential trade-offs if we want to locate in this place. Something that we touch on in our report and is kind of an evolving study is the impacts of climate change. I won't delve into this too much other than just to say we've done modeling across the prairie provinces. And interestingly, we're finding that temperatures are changing across the province, particularly in the winter. We're likely to see higher temperatures in a climate change affected world. And we're also going to see changes in precipitation timing. It's not necessarily that climate change will result in us having way less water precipitating in our province. The issue is more the timing of it. So if you see the figure on the top, we're seeing an increase in precipitation in the winter and in the spring, a reduction in the summer. So shifting the availability of water earlier in the year. So if we go back to our South Saskatchewan River at Medicine Hat graphic, what we might expect in a climate change affected scenario is for that peak water availability to happen earlier. and for that tail in the summer and into the fall and through the winter to be longer and perhaps lower. So again, looking at a project that will have a 30, 40, 50-year lifespan, you need to think about the potential impacts of climate change on water availability in terms of the actual volume available and in terms of the timing of when that will be available. So let's put these things together. We've looked at water demands for hydrogen, and we've looked at water available for new uses. If you put them together, where are the potential challenges? Where are the opportunities? So if we go back to our handy figure, and so now we've combined the map of project locations, overlaid that onto water available, and you can start to see some mismatches. Some projects that are being planned in locations where water availability will be a challenge. And again, that's not to say that they shouldn't be done there, or that we can't build hydrogen in the south of the province. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that presents a project risk. The potential lack of availability is a risk that project developers need to account for and find a way to manage. And maybe that is getting a water license transfer or something like that. There's lots of different ways you can address that water issue, but you have to think about it. Realizing that there's a potential gap in your water supply is such a critical first step. So on a project specific basis, there's that understanding of where water might be short. And then for a kind of a broader, almost societal perspective, thinking about how will hydrogen compete with other uses? So that, again, that water, energy, food nexus concept, if you look at the south of the province, are we trading off agricultural irrigation for hydrogen, or municipal growth for hydrogen, things like that? So it's a thought-provoking and it's a complex question, but we need to consider what is the best use of our water resources in that nexus context and make informed decisions from there. And as an operation for a project, thinking about how do you mitigate your potential water shortages, for example, through storing water. So a couple of examples just to really illustrate these challenges, potential challenges and trade-offs that I'm referring to. This is data from the city of Calgary. In the purple bar, we have the consumptive volume that they have allocated to them. They're licensed to take out that amount of water and not return it to the system. It's about 92 million across a few different licenses. So if you think about that volume, over the next several years or decades where that water can be used and not returned, assuming it's even available in the river, that's what they have as kind of their legal right to withdraw. The blue bar is an estimate of current consumption, and this is data that came out from the city back when there were water restrictions being issued kind of late last year through the winter. So about 650 million liters of daily demand, if you account for an assumed percentage of that gets returned to the environment and you gross that up over the entire year, that ends up being about 60 million meters cubed per year. And again, that's an estimate, but gives you a sense. It's about 2/3 of what they have, what the city has allocated is already being consumed. And then you look at the green, the yellow, and the red for hydrogen demand. This is, an estimate of what it might take to build out those hydrogen projects that are currently being talked about in the city, for example, under the Calgary Hydrogen Hub. So if you have highly efficient processes, you use things like air cooling instead of evaporative cooling, you reduce that water footprint for hydrogen. Maybe there's the capacity within the Calgary city license to build out all of this hydrogen. But maybe not. Maybe if you have the red line, you're looking at a scenario where water for hydrogen is actually, over and above what the city is allocated to use. And that would get you into a situation where you're competing with hydrogen versus more people living in the city, or hydrogen versus any other industrial development or commercial development that the city is interested in. So again, it's not to say don't do it. It's think about it carefully and what is the best use of that water, and understanding the trade-offs in order to have those discussions and make those decisions. A little further north in Edmonton, the challenge is less about gross availability over the year and more about timing. And so this is a hydrograph similar to what I showed for the South Saskatchewan with that kind of blue shaded area. This is simulated data looking at flows over the course of the year. The dark blue line is kind of an average year, or the median of the data. The green line is the dry year, that kind of lower quartile data. So imagine that's your kind of red line and your lower blue line if you're comparing to the previous figure. Those are significant flows. You look at the volumes that are coming through at any given time of the year, that's quite a lot of water. The interesting thing is, under the regulatory system that is in place for the North Saskatchewan River, your availability is actually quite a bit lower. So the river is regulated under the Surface Water Allocation Directive. So even though there are dams and control structures on the river, and even though flows are very high during certain parts of the year, the rules of the Surface Water Allocation Directive mean that during some times availability for new allocation is quite low. So that's the dotted lines on the figure. And actually, I want to zoom in just to show a little bit clearly what I'm talking about. So if we zoom in, so we've just shortened the y-axis on the figure. Again, the dotted line on the top, the dark blue one is availability for new allocations in kind of an average year versus a dry year being in that dotted green line. And you can see from week 16 to 40, 44, so kind of April, May to later in the year, really no issue in terms of availability. It's quite a lot that's coming through. The challenge is in the first several weeks of the year and at the end of the year, and if you have a drier year than what is being modeled here, is the availability drops very low because of how it's regulated right now. And if you overlay the potential hydrogen demand, so the gray bar is the low, kind of that green hydrogen level versus the high, and what we've shown as red throughout the North Saskatchewan River Basin. Laying those on, you can kind of see there's times when demand is outpacing supply. And so again, that's not to say don't do it. That's a warning perhaps for developers and managers in the region to say, hey, under the current system, we will need to store a bunch of water that's flowing past us during the middle of the year in order to use it later in the year. So it's a project risk, it's a challenge to consider, and it's a cost factor. Water storage is expensive, but it's not something that can't be managed. It just, again, seeing it and understanding the potential risks and challenges is a critical first step in then doing something about it. So hopefully those two kind of case studies give you a bit of a sense of how we're putting this all together when we talk about the water impacts of hydrogen development across the province, comparing water footprint, water demand for hydrogen versus what's available in that water, energy, food nexus context. Coming out of all of this now, what can we do about it? And I've mentioned this a number of times, but it bears repeating for developers of projects, whether that be municipalities or private industry or government investors or whatever it is, folks who are helping develop a hydrogen project of some kind really need to think about the water side early on. We say, and of course we're a bit biased, but we would say it should be amongst the first things you think about when you're looking at siting a project, and before you go and buy land, before you go and get listed on the stock exchange or invest millions of dollars, you should figure out your water situation. And that really is all about conducting a detailed and site-specific or watershed-specific availability assessment. Understanding the dynamics of the river system, understanding who is on that system withdrawing water and what's available for new uses and what those potential trade-offs could be. As part of that, thinking about climate change risks and how might the situation change over the course of the project life, which again can be many decades. And then having done all that analysis, you can start to think about, okay, how do we manage this? How do we mitigate our water risk? Or how do we balance the needs of our project with the needs of other water users in that nexus? More broadly, for policy influencers and decision makers and folks kind of throughout the province, it's interesting to consider the opportunities around developing knowledge around water in the province. So we have a lot of information about surface water in many parts of the province. There's a lot of effort and modeling and collaborative work going into managing those water resources. But that's something we'd like to see across all of the province. So things that we're doing in the south of the province around the SROM or the South Saskatchewan River Operations Model to simulate and model the system and then use that as a tool to inform collaborative decision making. That's a very powerful process, and it helps everyone in the system understand and manage the risks and balance those trade-offs. We'd like to see that occur really throughout the province. It's a very powerful approach and powerful tool. And then, as Dave mentioned, hydrogen is one thing, but carbon capture is another thing. So if you think about whether it's carbon capture or nuclear reactors getting put into Alberta or whatever it is, all of these kind of transition type industries, we need to think about the water impacts and the water availability versus potential use situations for those industries as well. And some interesting work has been done thinking about kind of what does the resource industry of the future look like in Alberta, and the ACR, or Alberta Chamber of Resources, has done some excellent work on that, thinking about the context of our future industries in that net zero 2050 transition. So I encourage folks to check that out as well. And then generally, understanding groundwater. I talked a lot about surface water today, almost exclusively. So there's a big question around what does our groundwater look like in the province, and what is a sustainable use rate for the groundwater? And that's a gap in some areas of the province, maybe more so than others, but something that we could fill if we want to have kind of an informed discussion about, again, how do we manage our water resources most effectively, and how do we balance those water, energy, food nexus trade-offs? So I hope that was interesting. I do look forward to the Q&A. I will pass things back to Vicky.
Thanks, Steve. I'll invite Dave to come back on camera and we'll jump into the question. We've got a really good list, and I think we'll have some great conversation here. So I will jump right into it. Start with a couple of the easier ones. So for Steve, you show some large variability between the low and high per unit consumptive water demands for the hydrogen technology types. Is there a primary driver for this variability, or are there multiple factors assumptions at play?
Yeah, it's a good question. The report, not to dodge the question, but I'd say the details are in a report. We spend quite a bit of time kind of noodling through exactly what the different components are. At a high level, it's multifaceted. Cooling is a big factor when it comes to water demand. I mentioned things like air cooling versus evaporative cooling. So think about like a cooling tower in a traditional nuclear plant or something, where that's a large volume of water getting evaporated into the air and they're thereby consumed. So that's a big lever, is what are you doing for cooling, and thereby can you reduce your water footprint? Water treatment is another one. For example, electrolysis, it requires a fairly high purity of water. So if you have a stream that is high in dissolved or suspended solids or whatever other kind of thing you need to get rid of, you can lose about 30 to 40% of what you're drawing in through that treatment process. So the actual net consumption is that much higher because you need such a high quality stream. So cooling and treatment are probably the bigger ones that we found. And then there's other things like how efficient is your process and how much reuse are you able to design into the system. And individual technologies may be more adept than others. So those are some detail-y bits, but heating and or cooling, I should say, heat management and treatment are the big ones.
Thanks. Building off a bit on that water quality comment, there's a question around how net produced water from in situ bitumen and heavy oil recovery, could that impact our conclusion? So could that be an alternative water supply?
Hmm. Potentially. It's an interesting one. Again, it would be a question of quality. Um, and then there's a link to kind of an economic question. So if it's technically physically possible to treat any water source for any purpose, but can you do it at an economic rate? And if not, then that becomes a big barrier for a given project. So I'd have to, you have to look at it kind of very specifically, but at a high level, it becomes a can you do it economically type question.
And I would argue that it's a geography question as well, because
Yeah.
that water is produced or used in a very discrete location in the province. And if the demand centers are significantly far away from where that water is currently being used, then you have some serious challenges getting it to where you need it cost effectively. And you're taking it out of one watershed to put it into another, which I'm sure you got a thing or two to say about that, Steve.
Yeah, there's a few hairs rising on those there, but yeah, that's a really good point, Dave.
All right, jumping to Dave, a question on carbon production. So the Canadian Critical Mineral Strategy has identified graphite as an important mineral. Currently, the focus for that has been natural sources in Quebec. Is there any research being funded to look at taking the carbon product from pyrolysis and converting it to graphite to fulfill this need without additional mining?
Excellent question. It's almost like I planted that person in the crowd. I didn't, but that's a great question. So there are a range of different carbon outputs from the pyrolysis process, and it's more than just one process. There's probably about a half dozen different ways to do pyrolysis, each of which you can tweak your process parameters and produce different things. So everything from amorphous carbon black to an activated carbon to graphite to graphene, which is exciting, to carbon nanomaterials like nano onions, nanotubes, etc. And those each have, I did those more or less in order of increasing value of the product. And so it's pretty exciting to see some of these solutions coming out that have these high value add products. Graphite would be one of them because it has certainly interesting applications in battery material production and a number of other applications. So yes, there is work being done. There's a number of companies that are developing technologies that are aiming specifically at that market, as well as the other ones I mentioned. And then there's other studies happening currently that are looking at how easy is it to convert some of the lower value carbon products that are being made into some of these higher value ones? Can that be done more cost effectively and with a lower resource input than the current methods? So yes, there's a lot of work happening in there, and I'm very excited to see how that materializes over the coming years.
Thanks, appreciate that. Going back to using alternative sources of water. So there's a lot of questions coming in around the same theme. So I'll summarize them all together. But are we considering water reuse as an option more generally? So can wastewater or stormwater realistically be used to generate hydrogen? Are we looking at technologies that can use non-pure sources of water? I think both of you might have some thoughts on that.
While Steve's finding his mute button, I'll say that current operations, they're certainly looking at those, and I believe some have sourced water from post-treatment solutions. So I think that is happening now. Can it be optimized? Well, perhaps. There's always new opportunities to try new and different things. That's why Alberta Innovates is around to support some of the innovative solution making that we can do in the province. So I'd say, to summarize, I believe that it's currently happening, and that always looking for interesting opportunities to do more things. Steve?
Yeah, I'd point back to the earlier question and say it's an economic and a geographic problem to some extent. And then it is a really interesting topic, this water reuse notion, for another reason, and that's to do with, I guess I'd say, kind of a net impact on the system. So if the plan is to reuse the water that the city of Calgary would otherwise be putting back into the system, then that actually could be a net impact on the river. If that water would normally go back in after treatment and is now being taken and turned into hydrogen that leaves the system. Yes, it's reuse, but it's still a net diversion from the system. Cases where reuse are maybe more interesting from a water security perspective, kind of on a watershed level, would be where you have a consumptive use. So like a hydraulic fracturing example, and this, is a whole technical issue perhaps, but if you had a water source that is otherwise going to be disposed of downhole, and you take that water and you do something effective with it in the hydrogen space, that's almost like finding more water and can alleviate the freshwater demands for sure. That's an interesting opportunity, but just have to be careful when we talk about reuse. It's not necessarily an environmental benefit from a water a volume perspective, depending on how it's done.
I think the being able to capture water from a condensing system. So if you see the stacks with all the steam coming off of them, if that water was captured and condensed somehow, then it recovers some of that water from being in the loss category on your water balances, and extends its use one more step, which offsets the use of fresh water from other sources. I mean, it ends up, if you're producing the hydrogen from it and that hydrogen goes elsewhere outside of the watershed, it is a net negative, but at least it's one step further towards a circular economy style water balancing.
Yeah,
Steve.
certainly.
Jumping into a different type of technology here. So does the source of biomass for gasification make a difference? Particularly if it is a lower water use crop, a waste material, or timber scrap from the logging industry?
Yeah, Dave, I see you're nodding. I have a perspective, but I wonder if you've got more technical experience here.
I have a little bit, but I'm certainly not the expert. I have some folks in the Alberta Innovates team that are specializing in renewable fuels, waste to energy, that would be way more adept at navigating this than I, but I'll do my best. Yes, there is a difference in the feedstock, the type of material that's being put in, not just from its lifespan as the biomass is growing, but also from a how easy is it to process perspective. And some of the materials are considerably harder to process, and they require subsequently a lot more water, which is why you see the big range in the numbers on the graphics that Steve had provided, and why it was so difficult to pinpoint a minimum. So with that, I'll maybe let Steve fill in a few blanks.
No, that's pretty well my thought as well. Again, not being an expert in the space myself, but it's I think you summarized that well.
Great. There is a question here. So I've got to scroll through. We've got a big list. So looking at the water supply side of things, there's some surprise to see that any of the Saskatchewan River Basin watersheds were labeled as high availability, given that they are all part of the Palliser's Triangle, or the notoriously inflow limited basins of Canada, where even ECCC suggests there is limited availability relative to use or demand. So could you comment on what led to this classification, and reference slide 18?
Yeah, so I think the figure is probably, or the part being referred to is in the Red Deer River Basin. And again, context is pretty critical, and this is a snapshot in time. So based on available data and the regulatory regime, we were trying to quantify and then translate that into colors. So should it be really high, or is it kind of medium, or something like that? Perhaps we can debate that. The point, I guess, being is at this time when the study was released, the Red Deer River Basin is not closed for allocation. It does have, certainly in its tributaries and on the main stem, some challenges with respect to seasonality and variability for water supply, but in and of itself is not kind of a point blank constrained resource. There's a lot of things that would suggest that will change in the near future, so that we could certainly make an update to the map soon. But at this current time, it's not as constrained as say the South Saskatchewan basins, but it's also not as abundant as the North Saskatchewan. So they're Red Deer and North Sask are in that same color category, but in truth, it's a fairly wide band. And we probably needed more colors to fully differentiate that.
Thanks. Next question is around the naturalized flow label that we use for the North Saskatchewan River. So question around how that was interpreted given that it's a regulated river, and then some comments also that by using the naturalized flow, it may have misrepresented the seasonal supply risk because the upstream dams have consistently increased average winter flow and somewhat reduced summer open water flow. So comment on that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and sounds like from someone who is well familiar with the system. And I alluded to it in that this is the current regulatory regime for that river. The Surface Water Allocation Directive is what is in place. It uses naturalized flows as the basis for, I'll call it, informing how decisions are made. So there's a ratio of, if naturalized flows are at this level compared to historic, then diversions are at that level. So you can do the math based on this rule set fairly simply, but it does require naturalized flow. I and WaterSmart are not advocating for a change to that per se, but we're very aware that a lot of folks in that river system are saying this doesn't make sense precisely because of that upstream storage and flow mitigation and those sorts of things that are in place. It is a regulated river from an infrastructure perspective, but the rules that are applied kind of force you to treat it like it isn't. So some would argue there's a mismatch there. What we've done in our report is use what is there currently in terms of the rules and the data. And so that's where you see that potential gap in terms of availability during those low flow periods. Again, just because that's what the rule is right now. So that was the basis for that model.
Great. Next question. Are you familiar with any water licenses in SSRB that have been transferred for hydrogen generation yet?
Excuse me. That's an interesting one. None that are publicly available that I'm aware of yet. This has certainly been an interesting topic of discussion, and I know there's some work going on here and there in the SSRB on that topic, but none that I'm aware of at this time.
I'm not aware of anything either. I'm not sure it would come across my desk if it did happen, but because we do more research and development work, but yeah, I'm not aware of anything.
A couple questions coming in for Dave on technology and HSUE. So I'll lump them all a bit together. But there's some questions around to what extent has methane pyrolysis been explored regarding alternate energy sources, maybe some research around storage, transportation, distribution at ambient temperature, and then also just general supports that HCUE can provide for export opportunities, if any. So it's a lot altogether, but just some general comments on where's research going and around pyrolysis and transportation.
I'll probably need a reminder. I'll tackle the first one. Research and development. So we have quite a number of research and development projects in pyrolysis with a handful of companies from our first competition, as well as from Emissions Reduction Alberta's testing work. So we're getting an idea of a spectrum of technology opportunities from that. We'll see how competition two shapes up here in the next little bit, and so I can't really comment on that, but it gives us an idea of some of the range of things. Some of the studies are related to pyrolysis analysis as well. So that we're going to gain some interesting knowledge in that space over the next little while, and I think it's an exciting area that a lot of people are interested in. So I know at the initial proposal stage in our competition, there was a strong upswing in pyrolysis interest. So I'll leave it at that. Maybe a reminder of the other parts of the question.
So questions around research into transportation and utilization of hydrogen, in particular at ambient temperatures and pressures.
There's some interesting solutions that folks are coming up with in that space. So I know there's a handful of companies in the province and probably quite a few elsewhere that are looking at, well, what if we got maybe ethanol from a bio-based source and then transported that to, let's say, a fueling station, and then converted that on site on demand to hydrogen. It's an interesting opportunity. The technology is available. We know how to do all that work. And what it does is it allows for that ambient temperature, ambient pressure storage and transportation, and it becomes essentially a liquid organic hydrogen carrier at that point. And so that is one solution for that from a bio-based opportunity. Others have actual liquid organic hydrogen carrier technologies that are quite interesting. And so those will basically, simple way to explain is you have a molecule and you can attach hydrogen to it through various means and transport that molecule at ambient temperatures, pressures, and then at the destination, you dissociate those two from each other, and you end up with a purified hydrogen stream. And then you can, of course, pressure that up if you need to put it in a pressure vessel or whatnot. But the transport and storage itself can be done very cost effectively. So there's some interesting opportunities in that space, and we're starting to see those pop up across the hydrogen ecosystem. And was there another component to that question?
There's a question around supports from HCOE for
HCOE.
export of some of these technologies.
Yes, thank you for that. So a couple of ways to tackle that. One is we have the competitions for funding technology advancement, and those solutions, once they're advanced sufficiently, can be those companies that are leading that can export those solutions as a value-add product to other markets, use them here as well. The other opportunities are to, in some of our studies, to see where is the best opportunity to apply these sorts of solutions. What is the distance that from a centralized large-scale facility like those ATRs and SMRs that we talked about earlier, from a distributed production location that you would use, say maybe a pyrolysis or an electrolysis. There's an optimum distance or a minimum distance from those centralized facilities where the cost of transport becomes higher than if you're actually just going to produce it in that distributed location. And so export can be kind of regional, or it can be larger scale. So those are some other interesting opportunities. Studies that will look at the opportunities for hydrogen export to international markets. We're definitely interested in those conversations. And so, lots of opportunities there. There's lots of folks knocking on the door, and the Hydrogen Convention in Edmonton in the spring, in April, typically garners a lot of interest from international groups. I think in 2023, there were 30 different international missions that had participated in that event, and I'm expecting that we'll see a lot similar to more this year. So there's a lot of interest.
Thanks, Dave. Some interesting thoughts here around maybe changing the production or adjusting production to match the variability of water supply, but also renewable energy supply. So the question is, has anyone looked at the economics of reduced throughput or even downtime due to limited water availability? And then building off of that, there was a second question. Given that typical water availability is usually spring and summer when we have higher solar resources, can we match then our hydrogen production to that renewable energy generation?
That's a very good idea, and I would start with saying that the way we run the natural gas supply chain right now is there are a number of underground storage opportunities for natural gas, because when we use it for heating, there's obviously more of a demand for that in the winter than there is in the summer. So one would size a production facility or like a refining type facility to produce a certain amount year round, and then when the demand is low, you pump it into your storage cavern, and when you have the high demand, pull it out and use it. And so I can imagine that we would be doing something similar in the hydrogen space. There are a number of pilot studies and research projects going on that are looking at saline cavern storage in some of the abundant saline formations we have available in the province. We have the expertise of doing this with gas, so it's just an adjacent advancement to do this for hydrogen. So I can see where one would be able to do that and then be able to more closely follow the water supply to be able to accommodate. Now, that's me observing as a non industry funder of technologies. I would imagine that the smart folks that are looking at it, producing hydrogen and transporting it and using it, are also thinking about these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a potentially valuable mitigation step you can take. Like I talked about storing water. If you don't want to build a big water storage capacity and operate that, then an alternative is to ramp down your production. And in some processes that is quite hard to do and kind of not really economic, and in others maybe it makes more sense versus the big build out for a capital investment like storage. So yeah, certainly something to consider in the toolkit for dealing with water stress.
So this next question I think is more for Steve. Can you comment on how the Prairie Province's Transboundary Water Sharing Agreement might affect water availability for hydrogen development?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. A lot to unpack. I guess for general context, there's transboundary agreements between Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba, where and I'll get the numbers wrong, but there's some nuance in there, but it ends up being a certain percentage of flow occurring in the South Saskatchewan and North Saskatchewan rivers must go into Saskatchewan from Alberta and from Saskatchewan into Manitoba. So certainly that's something that we are looking at in the work that we do, whether we're looking at kind of watershed scale modeling in the North Saskatchewan or South Saskatchewan, or for specific projects. The regulatory framework that exists in the province is kind of the current system to manage that. Like we have rules around what can be abstracted from the river that are meant to account for ensuring we have enough water that goes beyond into Saskatchewan. And I don't have the data at my fingertips, but I think for the whatever that is, 60 or some odd years that this agreement has been in place, Alberta has been passing significant, well, at least 10 or 20% more than what is required to Saskatchewan. So it hasn't been an issue for projects to date. I think there's been a few cases where there's been kind of a white knuckle moment a little bit, but for the most part, we're able to pass a lot more than we currently do. So from a purely Alberta centric perspective, we're not seeing that as an imminent challenge to the same extent as things like a local drought would be. But it's certainly something to monitor. And then that agreement is due for renegotiation, or there's being discussions about pushing for renegotiation from the other provinces. So that's certainly something to monitor and be aware of, but we don't see that as being as imminent a water risk as some of the other challenges that are more localized.
So in a similar vein, is there any chance that the province will look at diverting water from the north to the southern river basins?
Oh, that's an interesting one. And we hear that a lot. I guess the short answer is I hope not. As Dave alluded to, it's extremely expensive to transport water long distances. Trucking is typically done for some industries. You can have big water pipes, things like that. But when you get to the kind of volumes that we're talking about for a municipality or for an industrial use, they're huge, and the power required to pump all that, and the steel, like, it just becomes kind of economically non-viable really quickly. And then there's that whole question of, is that really the right way to use the resource, or should we figure out how to live within our means in each of these local contexts? And is that a long-term sustainable approach? Because if we move water from the north to the south, maybe one day we'll run out of water in the north, and is that fair to the uses that are required up there? So there's kind of, the flat out economic non-starter, and then there's this kind of moral question, I guess, to some extent. And the Water Act itself is written to expressly forbid that without an order of cabinet, basically. So it would be pretty well illegal to do that right now, transferring between the named basins in the province. And part of that is related to water quality as well. So moving biota from the north to the south, or vice versa. Some things we want to keep where they are relative to environmental health and aquatic species. So you see those kind of mega water transfer projects sometimes talked about around the world, and those are in some pretty extreme cases and with some pretty extreme dollar signs attached to them. So I hope that we can find better ways to manage our resources than resorting to something like that.
Great. Thank you. I think we'll do one last question here before we wrap up. My apologies to those that we have not answered, but there's been some great questions coming into the Q&A. So Dave, you did allude to this a little bit already, but are there any potentials for technologies to capture water vapor from existing heavy industry emissions, usually vented for hydrogen production, especially in those in Edmonton Industrial Heartland region, potentially reducing those geographical movements? Or is this the same potential issue economically as using contaminated liquid water sources?
The heat available in these streams isn't as good a quality as for some other streams. So being able to extract useful energy out of that while you're condensing that water is sometimes a bit of a challenge, and that plays into the economics. We see things like Stirling engines that have a certain efficiency to them that can be used to convert low grade heat into power. And I'm saying that because having a revenue stream helps to ease the burden of the financial cost of these sorts of things. But can it be done purely for water conservation purposes? I imagine it could. Can it be done cost effectively? That remains to be seen. I would imagine that some facilities are already doing some work in this space. And Vicky, that the water recovery technologies probably show up in your portfolio more than they do in mine. So you might be the better one to answer than I. But it is a potentially low-hanging fruit opportunity for water conservation and potentially for heat recovery, should there be the right solution available in the right location and have the possibility of additional economic opportunities come out of that. And so I don't know if you want to try wearing two hats, Vicky, or if you want to keep it clean, but I'll put that back out on the table.
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, I think for sure it's an opportunity. Um, there would be some of those challenges with quality. I think the key is having looking at these alternative water sources as an opportunity, but we need on the back end the hydrogen technologies that can take variable water quality and not the really high distilled water quality. So I think it comes hand in hand. I think there's an opportunity there and one that we should explore. Same with that the oil and gas produced water opportunity. Okay, well, thank you. We'll wrap up today's session. A big thank you to our speakers and thank you everyone for attending. I hope this discussion was informative. The session has been recorded and will be available for future viewing. Watch your emails for future sessions planned for 2024. We look forward to connecting with you again soon.